This weekend is also another interesting time, right? Because this weekend, the United States of America, the country that we live in, turns 250 years old. If you count from when the Declaration of Independence was written. But the founding is fairly simple, right? A people, they declare their own independence, they fight to be free, they build a nation with their hands and the help of the French a little bit. I have to say that as married to a French teacher. But all over the original 13 colonies, you'll find monuments of what was accomplished. This week in our text, we find another founding story, a very different founding story. A people led through a dry riverbed, led by the presence of God. A people marked by God's covenant promises, fed a holy meal, and given daily bread. And these people, they also set up monuments. But these monuments, they point to distinct and definitive acts of God. And so you have these two stories, founding stories, two identities. And the question that we are always confronted with as we read the stories in the Bible are, which story will be primary for us? Which story will give us our identity and will shape who we are and who we become? And what does it look like for us to live from the right identity, right, in our actual neighborhoods this week and in the weeks to come? This morning, I'm gonna walk us into our new life, the new life that is available to us sort of one movement at a time. And so let's just start where the passage starts with the Israelites. They are looking across the river at the promised land that God has said belongs to them. There's this river standing between them and their inheritance. And it's funny how rivers show up in founding stories, right? For America. We have the classic painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. And if you know the comedian Nate Bargatze and his Saturday Night Live sketch, as he crosses, he imagines, what his America might look like, and it's pretty hysterical. But George Washington isn't the only river crosser. We just went to Boston, where Paul Revere famously snuck across a river before taking his famous ride. And in the river crossings of the great foundings, what do you need? You need a charismatic leader to get your troops across. You need military strength and strategy. You need cunning and bravery. At least that's usually how the stories are told. And then Israel crosses a river. And they do none of those things. They have none of those things. The details are so bizarre, right? Like if you aren't reading along with us, you should try to. We've got some reading plans in the back. Pick it up. It's worth the read. In Joshua, a group of people are told to set out toward a river and just follow the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh your God, a box. It'll be carried by priests, and it's a small box, and it's covered in gold, and it's got these like strange heavenly creatures whose wings sort of form a throne on the top of the box, and this is called the Ark of the Covenant, and priests will be carrying it with a set of poles, and they will just like walk into the water. And I want to say something about the ark, and I want to say something about the water. The ark wasn't just some ordinary box. It was considered to be the seat, or like the throne of the living God who was traveling with them. And so the ark was a visible, tangible representation of God's presence with his people. It wasn't enough for God, who is spirit, to tell his people, I am with you. He wanted them to have a visual reminder that he was there in their midst. And consider this, like, God designed it this way. A box that could not move on its own. A box that could not move unless people carried it. And not just one person, but it always required more than one. And so consider that for the presence of God to be seen moving among the people, for God's presence to move, the people had a role to play in making God's presence visible. But the people aren't allowed to take the ark wherever they want, right? They actually are supposed to take it where God wants it to go. And God wants it to go through the water to get to the other side, which feels like there should be a chicken joke in there somewhere. But when George Washington and Paul Revere crossed rivers, they had a goal. Their goal was not to die. Right? Like, that was their goal. They were trying to not die and not have their people die. But the Bible tells a very different river story. In the Bible, water is death. And you're not to avoid death. You are to willingly submit yourself to it. You are to follow the living God right into death. Oof. So that you can come through death, and coming through it, come into a radically new kind of life. The Israelites, in passing through the waters, they leave behind the sin and the rebellion of the wilderness of the last 40 years of their lives, and they receive a new land and a new life, a life that is to be marked by trust and by obedience. And the New Testament will look back on these founding stories, and the authors, they are going to notice that there is a spiritual pattern in these stories, a pattern that seems to be brought to its fulfillment in Jesus. Jesus, the visible image of the invisible God, will enter into the waters of death. Jesus, the true Ark of the Covenant, leads the way. Jesus enters into death on purpose, willingly, deliberately. And Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. And we follow. Baptism is the act where we physically enter water, participating in death. And by God's power, we are brought through to the other side. And the other side is this radically new kind of life. Well, one part of that new kind of life is a new job. We might still work as teachers and as bookkeepers, as scientists and stay-at-home moms, but Jesus's best friend Peter will call us by our new job title. He will call us priests. All of us. Not like a special class, but all of us are given this new job. Priests. Well, what do the priests do? We have been given the job of carrying the physical, visible presence of God into this new world that we're entering. And we're told that we can't do it by ourselves. There always needs to be at least two priests together to make this work. We die. We die to our old lives, to lives lived for ourselves, to lives where we worked jobs just to make money, to build a life for ourselves, where we tried to make comfortable lives of pleasure, lives lived for ourselves. We've been given a new life where we get to make visible the living presence of God in the neighborhoods where we live, in the places where we work. And so the question for us is pretty clear. Like, have you joined Jesus in death yet? And the follow-up, have you entered into the new and full life that God has for all of us? If not, what's stopping you? And if so, how can you remember? How can you remember what has happened and stay motivated to keep following Jesus? Which brings us to our second movement, right? Having come through the waters of death, having left the sin of the wilderness behind, the people are to remember what God has done for them, to never forget. And so God instructs them to take up stones from the riverbed, from the place where death reigned. And so dead rocks pulled from the place of death, and as the people are setting up their camp, they're to set up these rocks to be a living testimony to what God has done. Joshua will say to the people, when your children ask in time to come, like, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them. You should tell them what God did for you. And I think here's a thing to notice for us. The 4th of July, you've probably seen all kinds of images of monuments, of great monuments, whether it's on TV or on social media, whatever, which are dead rocks built to remind us of our founding. But we need to be honest about these monuments. They are reminders of human achievement. They're reminders of human achievement. The memorial that God tells the Israelites to set up, these 12 stones from the place of death, they say nothing about human achievement. There's nothing about these stones that anybody could look at and go, yeah, I did something. Humans didn't cause the waters of the Jordan to stand up. Humans didn't make it possible for people to cross the Jordan on dry ground. That was entirely God. The Israelites are here in the land because God brought them to the land. God rescued them. God stopped the water. God led them across. And the Israelites cannot afford to forget that. Oh, we forget what God has done. Or how quickly we start to believe that we did something to make it all happen. The people, they exist by God's grace and power alone. Although, again, God has created an opportunity for the people to participate, right? Because these stones actually can't speak for themselves. They just sit there as stones. And let enough time go by and you go, does anybody remember why we put those stones there? How many parts of our lives are old stones that we've forgotten the stories of? The stones can't speak for themselves. When the next generation looks at the stones and says, what do these stones mean to you? The first generation has a job to do. They will have to tell the next generation and the next and the next all that God has done. Jesus' friend Peter doesn't just call us priests. He also calls us living stones. We are like these 12 stones pulled from the place of death. We are signs of what God has done. Our lives are evidence of God's power and grace. And yet, right, by ourselves, people could get the wrong impression. They could see our lives and they could assume that we are the product of human achievement, of trying really hard, of luck, of fortune, of whatever. And so we have a story to tell as living stones. We were pulled from the place of death. We are a living memorial. We are a product of God, a masterpiece set free from sin and death. Do you think about yourself that way? We are a new creation empowered by God's own Spirit, the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. The resurrection power of God is alive in us. We are living stones, visible memorials to the living God. And so do our neighbors see enough of us? Do they see us consistently enough for them to look at us and go, what do these stones mean? This question, our lives are an opening for the gospel. And we can't answer if we are still dead in the river. And we can't answer if we are hidden, tucked away in our homes and our private lives. Which brings us to our third movement. And I want to move a little quicker through these last three, but I'm trying to show how we read the story, recognizing the pattern, how we then enter the pattern ourselves and then see the difference between our identity as God's people and the other identities that might make a claim for us, identities like a national identity. The third movement into God's new life for us is the mark we take. That could sound scary because some of our neighbors have heard about something like a mark of the beast. Ooh, that sounds scary, right? The book of Revelation talks about a public mark that sets people apart and identifies people as belonging to the evil powers and principalities in our world. We go, ooh, I don't want to get that mark. But most people don't realize that Revelation actually talks about a second mark as well. A mark of the Lamb. God's people are marked by God and claimed as his own. This is what's happening in Joshua 5, right? Before Israel has done a single thing, they haven't fought a battle, they haven't built anything or planted anything. Before doing anything, Israel just receives a mark from God, identifying them as his. And it's interesting because for nearly 40 years, the people have gone without this mark. They traveled the wilderness without it, but now is the time. Now they will carry this mark for the rest of their lives. Their bodies will carry with them evidence that they have encountered the living God. It's supposed to remind them of God's promises going all the way back to their first father, a guy named Abraham. And as they think about their story going all the way back to Abraham, they can't help but think about how faithful God has been to his promises from the very beginning, going all the way back. This mark is supposed to remind them that their lives then are to be lived with some sort of faithful response to this God who has been faithful to them. Because God has done everything that God said he would do. And so God's people marked by God ought to respond with the same kind of faithfulness. And so in the story, the men of Israel are circumcised, and we could go on a whole rabbit trail about why they're circumcised on this side of the river when they're in danger of being attacked by anybody versus the other side where they were pretty safe. But I'll just let that hang out there. Instead, right, they have received this mark from God. Not only are they given a new life, but they are marked with a new identity. They are the people of God. And on a weekend like this, we can feel some tension between being Christian and being American. And there are other identities that might hold attention for us, right? But the reality for some of us is that we were born here. For others, we moved here. But regardless of how we ended up here, right, this has been our home. And in so many ways, on a day-to-day basis, we benefit from the life and the freedoms America has to offer. And so it's easy to mark ourselves or let ourselves be marked with flags and hats and symbols that identify us as Americans. Or maybe even to narrow that even more, we wear the red, the white, and the blue, and we are branded with a particular political leader or party or movement. So that when people look at us, what do they see? When they look at our houses, when they look at our cars, when they look at our lives, what is their first thought about who we are and what is important to us? Is it that we first and foremost identify as citizens of a particular nation? Or that we belong to, our loyalty lives with a particular politician? Or that we are inspired by, are enlisted in a particular movement? Right? Do our neighbors look at us and go, ooh, that's who they are? Or at least that's who people think we are because that's how we've been marked publicly. Are we making it clear where our loyalties lie? It's really interesting for God's people. There have always been warnings in the scriptures about competing marks, competing identities, competing loyalties, right? We have been marked by God. That is who we are. And the New Testament sees Israel's story and follows the pattern through Jesus in a profound way. This comes from a letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians. Listen to this. He says, in Jesus also you, and he's talking men and women, right? So that should make us go, ooh, this is a different kind of circumcision. But you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. When your neighbors look at your life, who or what do they think that you belong to? Are you indistinguishable from the surrounding culture and its political loyalties, its economic values, its moral commitments? Or have you truly been raised to a new kind of life, a life that is marked by the fullness of God? Has your baptism brought you into a new way of living, a new way of being human that makes it clear in daily and visible ways that you belong to God and that your God is good? Is it obvious from your life, the visible life that you live, that you are a citizen of the kingdom of heaven? What visible marks do you bear? Getting close to the end here. Israel is supposedly at some point going to face some battles. And yet, they have done absolutely nothing that sounds like appropriate military planning. They've marked themselves, making themselves vulnerable, and now they feast. They've done, like nothing's happened, but they just feast together. They eat a meal. And it's not just any meal. It's the meal. They participate in the founding memory of who they are. Think about the way that Thanksgiving works for us, right? We tell a nice story about pilgrims and natives. The Passover is kind of like this story, but infinitely more powerful. First, because it's true, but the Passover meal is the meal that reminds God's people that they were once slaves in Egypt. They were once slaves in Egypt facing death, but God rescued them from slavery and rescued them from death. This is who God's people are, a people who have been saved from slavery and from death. And not by their own might or by powerful leaders, but by God alone. And we can never afford to forget this. It's amazing that Jesus would come along then and take this very Passover meal and he would retell the story of the Passover, but through himself, announcing, I am the lamb that was slain. It is my blood that has been shed. It is my body which is being given. Right? Because of what Jesus has done for us, we have been set free from our slavery to sin. We have been set free from death. This isn't just a nice meal that we sit around and give thanks for random stuff. This meal is actually known, and one of its oldest names is essentially the Great Thanksgiving, because it is at this table that we thank God for all that he has done, for loving us, for pursuing us, for dying for us, for setting us free, for giving us a new identity, for claiming us as his own, and for sending us into the world with a job to do. If you've ever wondered why we don't spend more time on Sunday mornings strategizing for how to do church stuff, how to do the Jesus in every neighborhood thing, or right, we don't spend a lot of time strategizing. We do some kind of weird stuff, and one of those weird things is just come to this table every single week. Eat some bread, drink from the cup. If we're not careful, our kids sometimes think it's just snack time. But there is a sense in which we need to eat our salvation again and again. That we need to share a meal together. Joshua teaches us there's a better starting place than strategizing. It is eating. And not just any meal, but the meal. The meal that reminds us who we are and whose we are. This is the only way we will begin to move into our neighborhoods with any kind of clarity and from the right motivation, right? We recognize at this table that we have been loved so greatly, greater than any other love we have experienced from anywhere in our lives. And so, here at the table, something happens in us where we can't wait to go and to love greatly. Which brings us to our fifth and our final movement. God's answers to our prayers begin to change. It's weird because we still pray the same prayer. Lord, give us this day our daily bread, just as Jesus taught us. But in the wilderness, that prayer didn't actually require much faith, because like clockwork, every single day, the bread just appeared daily. And you had to decide whether to go out and to collect some and eat it. Even if you disobeyed on the sixth day and you didn't get double so that you'd have some on the seventh day when none fell, you'd be hungry for a day. But the moment you were no longer hungry, or the moment you were like, oh, I am hungry, I'll just go get food, it was always there. But something happens as Israel comes into the land. God still plans to give his people daily bread, but this bread will come through these larger annual cycles of sowing and reaping. And anybody who plants vegetables or knows anything about agriculture understands that there's just a gap between when you sow the stuff and when you get to eat from it, right? But this is part of how God plans to feed his people through through a cycle of sowing and reaping, through a larger 7-year cycle of letting the land rest. There's a larger 50-year cycle of returning land to its original owners. The Israelites are going to have to learn to trust God by doing things today that don't have any obvious outcome or result, that won't bear fruit until many years later. So there's something in this, an invitation for us that we are to do the things today, the good things that will lead to fruit in the future, even if we can't see it right now. And so in our neighborhoods, we will do work. We'll show up and we will do things in the name of the Lord with God, and because God has told us to do these things for our neighbors. And some of the work won't make any logical sense. We'll just look at it and go, I can't see how this is connected to the thing that I want to see happen. It won't have any immediate results, but it will bear fruit 3 years from now, 7 years from now, 50 years from now. Will you serve God obediently today, knowing that God will provide for us what we need? On this 250th birthday of the United States, two founding stories are in the room. They're always in the room, but they're acutely in the room this morning. Right? One is a story of a people who declared their own freedom and built a nation by their own hands. It's a story worth honoring and remembering and keeping in its proper place. The second story is way older. It is a story about a people who were made up of Americans and also every tribe and tongue and nation. A far larger people who were led through death by someone else's power, who were marked by someone else's promises, who were fed at someone else's table, and who were given someone else's daily bread. The people in this story, they didn't earn it. They received it and they entered into it. And today we choose whether we will enter into this story as our own. We are called to live it visibly, daily, together. In the neighborhoods where we live, we are not Americans who also happen to be Christians. We belong to Christ. Like, we are the people of God, the body of Christ. The part of the body that just happens to live in this place called the United States. But there are other parts. And today we are faced with the exact same questions the Israelites faced with Joshua. Will you follow the presence of God into the new life that God has prepared for you? Will you let your baptism mark you and set you out as belonging to God? Will you come to the table of your salvation, letting this story tell you who you are? Will you pray daily for God's daily bread? And will you participate in that daily work that God will use to provide bread in the future? It's interesting to me how a yes to all of these questions starts in one place, at the table where we now gather.